and welcome to another episode of Neurodiversity with Theo Smith and friends. Today, we're joined by another incredible guest where we're going to explore some important topics around their experience around dyspraxia and being ND, their journey in life from social work to creative environment builder for those who are ND who've been locked out of the system. But I don't want to tell you any more about this. You're going to hear from the individual themselves. We're really pleased to have Nathan on the podcast today. Nathan, would you just like to introduce yourself to our incredible audience? Let them know a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. So, my name is Nathan. Yes, I have a postgraduate degree in social work and in social work assessing. I also have a master's degree in the moving image. And I currently have a social enterprise called NeuroExpression, which is about empowering neurodivergent people, neurodivergent communities, and neurodivergent artists. I'm also twice diagnosed with dyspraxia, and there's also suspected ASD and OCD.
Yeah, because as we know, co-occurrence is more common than not, right? So often we're not always privileged to be able to get all of those diagnoses. But with one, often would come another. So
Mm.
thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate it. So you founded NeuroExpression, which you mentioned. You're obviously passionate about helping people within the community. Community, I mean those who've been locked out of the system or processed because of their neurological makeup or their background, right? Could you just tell us a little bit about that personal journey with dyspraxia, ASD traits, OCD? You know, what led you to go from getting the diagnosis and the understanding to thinking, I need to help others, right? I need to remove some of these barriers for other people.
Yeah, sure. So I think early on there was suspected that there was a suspicion that I was neurodivergent, but that neurodivergence was never specified. Um, even though I had some tutelage when I was younger, some home tutelage that my mother paid for. But basically, when I went to university, there was a suspicion that I had something, but that something had not been identified. So when I went to university, they openly promoted the idea of getting a diagnosis, and they openly promoted that there was support if you were neurodivergent. Of course, those I wasn't familiar with that word at the time. So I went to see an educational psychologist. I booked an assessment. It was a fairly straightforward assessment. And I thought maybe there might be some dyslexia or something of that nature. And then when the assessment was finished, um, and obviously when the educational psychologist had made their summary, they concluded that I had dyspraxia. So I guess that's when it began. I was someone who had dyspraxia. And then I guess the first question then is, what is dyspraxia? And it's funny because I didn't ask myself that question initially. I was more interested in the initial support that I could get from my university because I had the strong intentions of getting a degree. So I did that, and then um, in doing my social work qualification again, I didn't need to get a diagnosis then, but then I went through the process in terms of the support that they offer. And I think generally, I think universities are more far ahead with their support for neurodivergence rather than a lot of work companies. So after doing that, I went into the work industry, and if I'm honest, that there was some struggles there, but in that process, I learned about access to work. I learned about reasonable adjustments, and then I would say there was a point after working for about 10 years that I felt that I needed something more. I felt that there was some purpose that needed to be done. I didn't know what it was, but you've got the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, food, clothing, and shelter, but then there's like spiritual enlightenment at the top, whatever that means. Um, so basically, I then did a master's in moving image. And once I did that master's in moving image, I then had this idea of having a neurodivergent black mixed race exhibition, but I needed to get funding. So this led to the path of trying to get funding. I failed the first time, but then I got it the second time. And I had this idea of not only promoting neurodivergent artists, but also paying neurodivergent artists. And that's why the funding was essential. So once I did that, I then had this idea or redeveloped the idea of what does a neurodivergent friendly world look like and how could I be a part of creating that neurodivergent friendly world? And that enabled me on my journey to create NeuroExpression. Then again, there's different types of businesses. I know you would know this, Theo. There's different types. There's LLCs, there's sole traders, there's social enterprises. And for me, it wasn't just about money. Of course, we need money for things to function, but it wasn't about money. It was primarily purpose driven. So this led to, forming NeuroExpressions. And one of the things about NeuroExpressions is about empowering neurodivergent artists. Also, it's about paying neurodivergent artists because I realized that there was a gap in the market where there was a study done by another organization, forgive me, I can't remember their name, but it said 87% of neurodivergent people are not paid for their work. So there was an expectation of their work without being paid. So I wanted to be the difference in that. But that meant I had to go for more grants. So I went for a second grant to create what I would deem a neurodivergent friendly exhibition. And I was successful in getting that grant, and that's going to exhibit 5 different neurodivergent artists. We'll provide them reasonable adjustments. They'll be paid. And also, there will be a digital, virtual reality element for people that have physical disabilities that maybe can't attend, but will still be able to experience the exhibition. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, it did. It's lovely. Well, just as a little side, why the visual arts then? Because to go from being a social worker and from seeing some of your background and hearing you talk earlier, it seems that is a great route for you to do some work in. To then shift to visual arts, and I get it. It's like it is finding there is something else missing that you want to do. Why visual arts?
Let me clarify that. Again, I need to clarify the beginning. So even though I qualified as a social worker and I qualified as a social work assessor, I didn't actually do social work, and there's a reason for that. Because of dyspraxia affects the fine motor skills, right? So the fine motor skills are the hands and the fingers, which means if you're trying to drive, your fine motor skills are essential. And because I have issues in these areas, I wasn't able to drive, which meant effectively at the time, because I didn't understand what access to work was and what reasonable adjustments was, I could not get a job in the industry, even though I tried to go through various agencies. And that led to me going into a project worker slash senior support worker role. And I went into supporting people that had addiction, like substance abuse, homelessness, dual diagnosis, and they were very enlightening experiences. But I guess there was always a creative element in me. I come from quite a creative family, and I just wanted to tap back into that. And ironically, social work was about it was about providing social benefit, but it was also about taking the safe route in terms of having like a stable wage. And I got to a point where I had really nothing to lose. So I just thought, you know what, I'm going to go with my heart and I'm going to go with what I want. And what happened was it was quite funny because I saw the advert for the Masters, and then for some reason, I was watching documentaries on Jean-Michel Basquiat, and Jean-Michel Basquiat is considered the king of neo-expressionism, which is basically a certain style. It's a very, very unique style of drawing, and I was very drawn to that. And that really spoke to me. And also, I was into doing whiteboard animations and I was very much into explainer videos for neurodivergent people. So I just felt that there was something there creatively for me. And because I did a master's in moving image, I was surrounded by some creative people. So it was fostering that energy. So it made sense that I would create something that, yes, would have maybe a bureaucratic element to it, but also would tap into that creative thing that was innate. And I think a lot of neurodivergent people are very creative. So yeah.
That's fascinating. So, and I agree, there's a huge amount of creativity in ND talent for sure. And actually, your story is not unique. It is unique, of course, to you, but in terms of many of us, like almost waking up one day, and this might happen 10 times over, right? And going,
Mm.
hang on a minute, there's something missing, right? And I'm going to run
Yeah.
off in that direction or this direction. And often there's a big driver to help others as well. There's somebody I know called Bill Borman, who is an advisor to tech companies. I've had him on the podcast, and he during COVID just started going out and feeding the homeless,
Mm,
and not just the homeless, but those living on the streets, a variety of different challenges and needs, because a lot of the charities stopped going onto the streets to feed
mm,
people. And so he just started cooking food and going out and doing it. And it's funny. He also got involved a lot in art and the creative side in London for a lot of people who lack the exposure, lack the opportunity, and through some of his knowledge and expertise, he was combining these two almost very different worlds. So
mm.
I love the concept and the idea that you're looking at there to enable individuals who have been locked out of the system, enabling them to be able to show their work, be able to be paid, be able to be recognized for their value. And the
Yeah.
reality is, we know that a disproportionate amount of people, dependent on their upbringing and background, who are autistic or ADHD, are ending up with social services or in prison or being excluded from schools. So,
Mm.
on that perspective, like with all of that to consider, uh, is that your ambition then, to be able to find mechanisms locally, nationally, to be able to provide a platform for individuals within these creative spaces that haven't had that platform before? Is that the major driver from a social enterprise perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's multifarious in the sense that on one hand it was about platforming neurodivergent artists. That was definitely a big part of it. But then it was trying to get feedback from the neurodivergent community. And then also it's about trying to promote some awareness and knowledge to the neurodivergent community as well. There is something I would like to share. For example, one of the final pieces to my puzzle was I read a book. I don't want to butcher this, but Temple Grandin, I believe, is a professor that is autistic, and she wrote a book. Um, I think the book's called Visual Thinking, but I may have butchered that. But there was an important point she made in that book, and in that book she said that the educational system is geared towards verbal thinking. So when we take a test, it's all verbal thinking. I think, therefore I am. That's verbal thinking. But the issue is that neurodivergent people are predominantly visual thinkers. So that means because the educational system has a preference to verbal thinking, that means that the neurodivergent people who are visual thinkers are at a substantial disadvantage. When I read that, that to me was like the final piece to say, yeah, there's a lot of untapped talent and a lot of people are not getting the opportunities, and there's various reasons for that. A lot of it is ignorance. People don't understand. A lot of neurotypical people do not understand neurodivergence. They don't even, may not even understand the learning styles. Why would they if they're verbal thinkers? So yeah, part of it is about platforming neurodivergent artists, but a big part of it as well is I would want to, I want to promote the idea of accessible formats. So these are materials that are accessible for neurodivergent people. I definitely want to promote the idea of reasonable adjustments and also access to work. And the other part of the social enterprise, which is facilitation for different types of companies like councils and things like that, that's what I try and do. I try to promote the idea of a neurodivergent-friendly workspace.
Amazing. So just to capture some of that, Temple Grandin, Visual Thinking is the book. I've just got it up there. Um,
Yes.
so there we go, just for people looking for that. Temple Grandin also incredible in terms of showing how you can take something that's not a nice concept, like killing animals for meat, but you
Mm,
can do it in a way that is more considerate to the animal, right? More humane, and to be able to tap into something in a way, visual thinking, in a way that others don't realize, that actually shadows were scaring cattle before the point that they were getting to the end of it. And just by changing some of the ways that they experienced that journey, by being hugged tight and not seeing those
mm,
scary shadows, can massively improve their experience. And I just think, how many opportunities are there in life for visual thinkers to be able to have that positive impact on society, on ways of working, on events, on the visual arts. I think so many missed opportunities, and there's not enough work done around individuals like your good self looking at what that looks like, looking at the structure of that, and how a local authority could think about that in terms of its work practices or the way it delivers events for communities or its spaces or places. I
Yeah.
think it's a massive, massive missed opportunity. I also think as we start to go into this new phase of what the UK is, for example, we have an opportunity here where perhaps there will be more funding and support at some point to help redesign the way that kind of public services work, and so I'm
Yeah.
excited by that, and I think that the timing could be
Yeah.
right. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
and there's a lot of problems with like, okay, so I'll start with the positive and then move on to the more challenging things. So I think the Arts Council, definitely where I am, have been very supportive of what I do. And I'll give you an example. So when my first grant appeal was rejected, they did meet up with me and they explained to me why. And in explaining why, it enabled me to, you know, to make the appropriate amendments. And I really appreciated that, to give me that feedback and to offer that feedback. They also offered me support because of my neurodivergence in terms of putting together the application. So what I would say is that the Arts Council, in my experience, or the arts councils that I have dealt with, are definitely have been strong advocates of implementing reasonable adjustments, even if it means those reasonable adjustments may cost them money. So I have to give credit where credit's due. And this is why on my social media posts, when I do have a successful grant, I always acknowledge it and I say thank you, because without that funding, I wouldn't be able to do the neurodivergent and friendly exhibitions. Moving on to education, I think one of the issues with education is that they'll say things like, if technically speaking, if we're talking about, I know a lot of people are against capitalism, but if we're talking about efficient capitalism, if you have something that provides value, then efficient capitalism means that someone should pay for it, right? But it's whether the services provide value. The problem is with the educational system is that if you go to them and you go to them with something that can provide value to neurodivergent people, and I'm going to say education, I'm going to use that term broadly, they'll just say, we don't have the money. And legally, that doesn't really make much sense, because legally, the whole point about the Equality Act and the whole point about reasonable adjustments is that if there's something that can, say, a service that can provide value to a neurodivergent community and enable them to flourish in the academic environment, they really shouldn't be saying no. But what happens, not only do they say no and there's to stop you from delivering effective services to them, then you have the additional problem that other entities will say, well, we're not responsible for that funding. That funding should come from the educational quote unquote system. So you've got this system that actually disempowers neurodivergent people from getting services. Now, I need to put a caveat there. In my experiences, um, universities, in terms of providing support for neurodivergent people, are ahead of the curve. But if you're coming in as a neurodivergent social enterprise, you can have a great idea, but unless you've got some good contacts, it will be very, very difficult for them to see the vision, and B, for them to pay for those services. I could be entirely wrong, by the way, but that's just, that's my perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of red tape, isn't there? That's the reality. And
Yeah.
your experience there is you've had some feedback. I've recently gone for government funding, and the feedback is there, but there's a wall. So you get a little bit of feedback, but you can't ask any questions. So you
Mm.
get your few lines to explain, but there's no opportunity to explore it further. And I often find sometimes the innovation, the stuff that starts at the very beginning, that's really trying to push the boundaries, is very rarely going to get government funding because they're always looking for more proof of concept. Do you know what I mean? So therefore, that
Yeah.
becomes like it's the kind of chicken or egg scenario. And the problem we've also got around this, so I'm interested in your thoughts around this, is we need ND people, right, to be leading on certain
Yes.
projects and work. However, we've got long application forms and very complex ways of gaining funding. And coming back to your
Yeah.
visual thinking,
Yeah.
that then becomes like a huge barrier for ND talent to access the funding they need support to support ND people. So you end up with non-ND people accessing the
Mm.
funding to support ND people, and ND people getting locked out. So neurodivergent people being locked out of
Yeah.
the system. What are your thoughts
I
on that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, again, it's geared towards verbal thinking, isn't it? So because it's geared towards verbal thinking, that means there's a barrier. I think the problem is that a lot of people may say things like, say, for example, anyone can put an application together and say, I provide reasonable adjustments. But then when you ask them what that means, they might struggle. And I guess you can have people that can make the same claims that you make, but are not providing the same services that you do, but they may be better at putting together an application form than someone, and
Like being
therefore
better in an interview, right? You may be better in an
it's
interview doesn't mean you have
it's a
better
great
experience. You just,
it's a
you
it's a
just
that's a very good point. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, interviews. I mean, I saw this is slightly off topic, but I remember I saw a documentary that was basically talking about people that were narcissistic and how they prosper in work environments. And what they were saying was that people that had like certain narcissistic personalities, they were great at interviewing. They were really good at interviewing. So
and
therefore
at
they would
leading
go through the
countries
ranks.
apparently,
Say that again?
and at leading countries apparently.
Yes, yes,
Whether you
yes.
agree
So
with it, like they seem to get into positions of power. That's the reality.
yeah, so it becomes because the reality is most it's a question to ask, isn't it? Just because someone performs well at a job interview doesn't mean that they're going to be better at the job. Here's an example. So let's say if you've got someone and they can do 5 grand in sales a month, but they're terrible at interviews. But then you've got someone who's great at interviews but can't sell anything. Now, as someone who runs a social enterprise, I know who I would want. And it wouldn't be the one that's great at interviews. You basically want the person who can provide value to your social enterprise or your business, whether it's an LLC, sole trader, you know. So it's difficult because the grant thing is you have this same problem. You have an institutional issue of it being geared towards verbal thinking, but then you've got the point that you make about the interviewer, the person good at interviewer but not good at doing the job. You've got the person that might be better at doing the grant but isn't better at delivering the services. And I guess the question for me is, how do we deal with that issue? I guess one of those ways of dealing with that issue is to provide reasonable adjustments. And I will say that the Arts Council that I dealt with, they did do that for me. But most people may not have the knowledge on how to do that. So that's one way. And the second way is, I guess, vouching for someone's credibility. So if someone says, okay, you talk about reasonable adjustments, what reasonable adjustments have you provided recently? Where is your track record of your company providing reasonable adjustments? And what does reasonable adjustments mean to you? Obviously, that's just a part of it. There'll be other parts of it. But I guess it's about how do we properly vouch someone's credibility, which is difficult because, again, using the job interview analogy, someone can seem so credible in a job interview, but then perform so poorly in the job. So it's about because let's face it, no one goes to a job interview and goes, I'm really not very good at this job, I'm going to be late, I'm going to be boring, I'm not very innovative. No one's going to say that. We're socially conditioned that when you go to a job interview, it's almost like you're meeting someone's best representative as opposed to them. So you know, and obviously I'm being slightly facetious, but it's difficult that I guess the barrier is how do we empower neurodivergent and how do we empower ND people to not only apply for grants but to be successful for grants? And I agree with you. ND services or services that are geared towards neurodivergent people need feedback from neurodivergent people. That should be the driving force. Now, it's an important distinction to make here. So my understanding, you've got neurotypical, neurodiverse, and neurodivergent. So neurotypical is what is socially seen as the norm. Neurodiverse is people that are different, and then neurodivergent is that people that have neurological conditions such as dyspraxia, ASD, dyslexia, etc. And I would say that the focus should be neurodivergent, feedback from neurodivergent people, and then neurodiverse people. And we would encourage neurotypical people to be involved as well. But the emphasis should be the neurodivergent community, just in my opinion.
Yeah, and just for a little bit of clarification, I mean, neurodiverse, technically, from a grammatical perspective, is everybody as well.
Yes, yes.
We are all neurodiverse in that context. However,
True.
certain elements of the neurodiversity community have identified more with neurodiverse specifically to identify as being ADHD, autistic, dyslexic, dyscalculic.
Yeah.
However, people will challenge that. And I love that you bring that up because this is a, a continuum of conversation around what is the right terminology. And I laugh a bit because I'm dyslexic, therefore I really struggle with grammar. And so for somebody to be really like, here's the barriers around what you can and can't say, I'm like, I struggle with what I can and can't say from a grammatical perspective anyway. So you just can't
Yeah.
put those barriers around me. I'm going to get it wrong.
Mm,
But you know what? The reality is that if we think about what you were saying before about nobody turns up to an interview and goes, I'm rubbish, right? That is true because we condition people that that's not what they should be doing. However,
mm,
we also then condition individuals like you and I and others who are autistic or ADHD or whatever, all different terms. We then tell them you really struggle. You're disabled neurologically. You
mm,
have problems with social interactions, or you have problems with focus, or you have problems with words, or you have problems, whatever, right? We're listing the long things that's wrong with them. And now society has almost got people to say, you also need to tell employers your responsibility to go and tell employers how rubbish you are, right? Because that's the way I see it. Here's the long list of how rubbish you are. If you don't go and tell the employer how rubbish you are, it's on you, right? So I think this is another issue that we have when we talk about reasonable adjustments of saying if the individual doesn't come in and tell us everything they need to be adjusted, and we don't adjust it, it ain't our problem. And I think so. Again, there's something in what you're saying about
mm,
supporting organizations to understand that better, starting with
mm,
events in the
mm,
creative industry, for example, learn from those experiences, and then start to
mm.
help organizations or local authorities or whoever else see those things that are barriers and how they can reduce some of those barriers so we don't have to go cap in hand begging for these adjustments and
Yeah.
saying how rubbish we are just to be accepted.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a few things to say there as well. I think that and this is an assumption on my part, but I think society has a confirmation bias on what neurodivergence is. And I think that confirmation bias is negative. I'm talking about society's
Yeah,
perception. But neurodivergence is about difference. It's not about deficit. And let me articulate this. There was a study done on dyspraxia junior doctors. And in this study, I think it was a very small study, it showed that these doctors, these junior doctors that had dyspraxia, they they were able to interact effectively because they had, I believe the term was sophisticated strategies, which was just alternative ways to compensate for any issues that they had that was associated to their neurodivergence. But here's the important point. The important point was that at the end, they didn't see their neurodivergence as a barrier. They didn't see it like that. They just, they how can I put it? I don't want to butcher the study, but basically, their neurodivergence led to them finding creative solutions. So they accepted that they were dyspraxia, but they didn't see dyspraxia as a barrier. Now, here's the issue. I think society sees neurodivergence as a barrier. So there's what we call a negative connotation to the word. And this is the problem, because if you go to any neurotypical person, you could be a boss, regional manager, CEO, ask them the question, what is a neurodivergent friendly world? See what answers you get. I would be very doubtful if they would be able to answer that question unless they did some research beforehand. So, and why is that relevant? It's relevant because that person is not qualified to make a statement or a negative statement or a negative observation about any person that is neurodivergent. So it's the lack of social understanding which becomes the biggest problem, because it's almost like, think of it like this, right? Like, say if you have a computer game and you got a character and the character has like really good speed and really good power but is slow. If that character is neurodivergent, they would say, oh, that's a bad character. But that's the perspective of the person. But if the character is neurotypical, they would acknowledge the strengths, and then they would acknowledge maybe there's some weaknesses. So it's the framework, the social framework of the individuals and of society that's the problem, I believe.
Yeah, it's interesting because when the Mexican tetra fish were pushed into the darkened caves of Mexico, right, they were disabled by the fact that they had eyes, they could see, and all of a sudden they were in darkened caves where they couldn't, right? So all of a sudden they were disabled by that fact of their world had significantly changed,
Mm.
and therefore to survive was going to be very, very difficult indeed. Anyway, they evolved then to become blind, and that allowed them to save energy. They then evolved to get rid of their eyes completely, so they're known as the Mexican tetrablind cavefish. They have no eyes, right? Because they evolved to get rid of them to save energy, because we use a huge amount of energy to process images,
Mm.
even when we're asleep. And these tetra cavefish have very similar eyes to us, believe it or not, in terms of the makeup before obviously they became blind. There's other examples of tetra fish who didn't get pushed into the darkened caves. And I just think that's a wonderful example of, when we're deciding what is disabled versus what is not, it is almost
Mm.
certainly the environment, right? And the environment we often have control of as human beings, because we are not the fish. We control a lot of our environment. We build the
That's right.
infrastructure. We decide the
Mm.
work practices and processes. We decide how we treat that fellow human being in front of us. And therefore, it is exactly like that point you're making around dependent on the individual in their life experiences. They may absolutely see it as a strength. The not seeing
Mm.
in the darkened caves of Mexico is a strength versus those with eyes, because they're saving energy to sustain that energy for survival. That's incredible, because there's
That
no
is
point
incredible.
seeing.
That's an amazing example.
And I think we miss that so much. And exactly as you've mentioned there, we don't give enough energy to individuals to feel that they are incredible. We are incredible as human beings, right? But we've often
Mm.
allowed other people to tell us how rubbish we are too often, that we struggle to see the good in ourselves. And then
Yeah.
people tell us they're refusing to make those adjustments. And therefore it's on us again. It's on us to feel bad, to not feel good enough, and to be begging. What sorry, what are some of the adjustments then? What are some of the things we can consider when
Yeah.
creating this event? What would we expect to achieve by taking some of those barriers down? What would they look like?
Yeah, so it depends on the context. So, for example, in the work context, there's an institution called Access to Work. I use the term institution because I don't know what to call them, but you have access to work, and they can, if you have paid work, they can provide reasonable adjustments. These can basically, a reasonable adjustment, from my perspective, is a thing to take away the barriers associated with the neurodivergence. So, this could be a laptop, this could be specialist equipment, this could be a job coach, or a support worker. It could be specialist software to enable you to do flowcharts, to enable you to do mind maps. It could be training. It could be a variety of things. So let me take it from the perspective of a neurodivergent friendly exhibition. So if someone's a visual thinker, maybe I need to provide the information in flowcharts, or maybe in some form of visual communication. It could be something that's non-economic. It could be like speaking speaking slower, or maybe the speed of the diction may need to be slower for some people, because especially with things like dyspraxia, it's a processing issue. Um, so it could be things to do with communication. Um, but yeah, it could be a variety of things, and it depends on the individual. So, for example, if you're in a job and you need to drive and you can't drive because of your neurodivergence, then a job coach that can drive would be the thing, i.e., the reasonable adjustment to take away the barriers associated with the neurodivergence. So that's certain things. But then another important thing is I can't think of a better word, but the spirit of the workplace, because people can implement reasonable adjustments, but if they do it in bad faith, the person is still going to struggle. It has to be done in good faith. And I don't want to butcher this, but there's a concept called the Pygmalion effect. And my understanding of the Pygmalion effect is that you are basically a product, going back to what you're saying, of the environment. So if you've got people telling you how great you are or how good you can be, you're more likely to become the best version of yourself. But if you've got negative, neurotypical people telling you how bad you are or how negative you are, then you're more likely to become the worst version of yourself. So the environment, the attitude is really important. You know, negative confirmation bias can put us in a psychological prison, any of us, whatever we are, you know. So yeah, there's some practical things. Um, Even with the flowchart stuff, there's different applications. There's the speech to text software. I don't personally use that. Um, and even some basic training, like you can look at your smartphone, and my neurodivergence, I can't find any location. I don't know how I coped before Google Maps, but just using Google Maps effectively could be a reasonable adjustment if your job evolved in going to different locations and you would struggle with that. Maybe additional training, maybe the training to be broken down in a visual way. You know, there could be a variety of things. Uh, Another thing that I think a lot of neurodivergent people could benefit from is either home working or a combination of home working in the office, depending on their condition. So there's really a long list of things that can be done, but it doesn't just involve the individual. It will involve the individual, it will involve the team, it will involve the management, it will involve the regional management, and it will involve the culture. And it's important that the culture is inclusive of because what's there's that thing that charities have, disability confident, but a lot of, again, go to these people and ask them how many levels are there to disability confident, and just name me one thing from disability confident. They probably will not be able to tell you. So it's about embodying it, it's about really being that. I'll give another example. You know, every company will have a will have values, right? And one of the values would be respectful. But then if you ask someone, what does that mean? And they can't tell you, then how do they know that they're following the values? But yeah, the reasonable adjustment, it's really a massive thing, and it's a big thing in my life. I wouldn't have a job if I wasn't aware of A, reasonable adjustments, and B, how to implement them. And they're part of the Equality Act. To my understanding, it's a legal requirement.
It is, yeah, and but it's difficult, right? Because it's a legal requirement, but still, when individuals have faced bias, when individuals have faced barriers in the past, when individuals have
Mm,
lost their jobs in the past because they've stood up and asked questions,
mm,
then people are very scared of asking these. There was Auticon did some research about 2 years ago,
mm.
asking individuals who are autistic in the workplace, would they disclose? And 40% of them said no. Right,
Yeah,
so 4 in 10, no.
yeah.
And the reasons around it were varied, but it was like not ready, fearful of what other people will think, past bias, worried about it, they've seen it go wrong in the past. So all of these reasons. So I think that the psychological safety needs to be built. I think
Mm,
organizations need the mechanisms to be able to deal with it effectively. And I think, you know what, the biggest thing, Nathan, I think a lot of people, it's a new language for them. And like you mentioning, not originally knowing about these opportunities for support, and then
Mm,
when you did, and you were accessing them, and you learned about the funding, and you failed, but you got support to know about next time, and that's a whole journey. But that's like learning a new language. And the problem is a lot of people are way further back on learning that language than you and I, yet they're trying to communicate this new language to a manager or a fellow employee who doesn't know a single word of this language. And it's just put that
yeah,
into like the context of
yeah,
Spanish.
that's a very
I've
good.
only just started learning Spanish, and now I'm trying
Mm,
to communicate complex ideas in Spanish
mm,
to somebody who doesn't know Spanish. And it just,
yeah.
when you put it in that context, that these are the type of barriers that individuals face at the moment, and the reality of the situation.
It's so true. And just to give an example of that, um, you could have a manager, right? And you could say, oh, we need to do some reasonable adjustments. And then the manager could say, oh, well, it's I determine what's reasonable. Legally, I think that's not correct. I think the reasonable adjustment would be more determined on the neurodivergent person who can say that, yes, this is a reasonable adjustment that would support me. But even a simple misunderstanding like that can create a disempowering environment. It really can. I may change my thoughts on this, but I also think that a lot of neurodivergent people may benefit from entrepreneurship, even though that's a very, very difficult path. But I think it perhaps may be beneficial. I may change my mind on that in years to come, but I feel that may be a better path if they're unable to get the appropriate reasonable adjustments to enable them to prosper in their work environment.
I actually think the other way to achieve that is, I think, through intrapreneurship. I can't even say the word properly, but using entrepreneurship, but within an organization. So allowing people a bit of freedom and flexibility to enable them to explore some of these things that they enjoy and to bring that back into the workplace. There's some of the best
That's a
experiences
good
I've
point.
had when I work in an environment where I've got my work that I need to do, but they recognize I've got this appetite to always be looking at other stuff. So being able to feed that appetite
Mm.
with maybe 20% of my workforce keeps me happier, more productive. And then I end up coming up with ideas, solving problems that they didn't even know or think about. But you've got to create the mechanisms for somebody to do that. And I don't think most organizations do. And I also think this is not just an ND thing. I now think the new generation of young people coming through have their outside interests that are
Mm.
huge passions that are actually becoming little businesses. And like, rather than
Mm.
organizations going, oh, we don't like that you've got this other business going on, rather
Mm.
going, well, how can we enable that? How can we incorporate that so you bring some of that back? How can we lift you up and elevate you to do that? That if one day you go and do that full time, that's okay, because you would have given us loads of like knowledge and insight on that journey.
Yeah.
I think we're just at this moment in time where organizations are grappling with this, but the benefit of this younger generation coming through, almost
Mm.
kicking the doors down to ideas and concepts that you and I are fighting for, but for maybe different reasons. But I feel there's this kind of energy behind this change and transformation in the way that we now work.
Theo, I think you've hit the nail on the head, really, because I think what you're touching on is neurodivergent people not only providing value to the workplace, which is essential, but it's also about um, living a purposeful life and finding part of that purpose within their work. And I think that's important for everyone. And I think within work, sometimes managers and business owners, they think about the numbers, and of course the numbers are important. Within a capitalist society, they have to make money, otherwise the business doesn't survive. But imagine in a world where you can, it's a different way to look at it, because if you stimulate someone's purpose, you're more likely to get those numbers that you desire. And that's a different way of looking at it. And I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I think the other thing that a lot of traditional businesses are afraid of is the new innovations that are coming through AI And a lot of new business, a lot of old traditional businesses are actually quite afraid of that. I don't know, maybe some of those things may be valid, but what I will say from my experience is that AI can be an ally for someone that's neurodivergent. It can really, really be supportive, not only for the individual, but also in providing value, because you can enhance a productivity of a business through AI. And I think there's a misconception that AI will do everything for you. It's not about it doing everything for you because then it has no value. Anyone can do that. It's about the collaboration, the effective collaboration. So, for example, a lot of people talk about ChatGPT, right? And they'll say that it will just write scripts for you. But instead of looking at it from that framework, look at it from the framework of feeding ChatGPT certain questions so that it can give you certain value. And that collaborative relationship with technology can really be beneficial. And I think neurodivergent people can really prosper in that way. So for a really basic example, Easy Read was something that would cost a lot of money, and it was basically materials that were accessible for neurodivergent people. We can now do this for free using basic AI tools. So it's limiting the cost and it's more inclusive of neurodivergent people. Just interesting. What's your thoughts on the AI and the workplace and
Yeah.
neurodivergence?
Yeah. So as we draw this to a close today, and I want to hear what's next for you. I want to also know where people can find you and connect with you. But the AI, I absolutely agree, is powerful for ND. We now this data that's come out. Arctic Shores provided some data on a high proportion of students, something like 8%, 80% of students we're going to use AI in the next 12 months for a job application, right? So that's exploding. Young people coming through using AI. But they
Yeah.
also found that disproportionately more ND talent was using it on a more regular basis than other talent. So already we're recognizing, wait a minute, this technology is helping me understand stuff I didn't before. Wait a minute, when I used to sit there for 3 hours trying to get this first line out, now I can go, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to get there. Here's some key points. Right, help me write the first line, and like, bang, you're there. Ah, great. And then the brain's going. So, like, for me, AI is another moment of transformation, just like the keyboard was for somebody who can't spell and couldn't say their name properly and still doesn't use the English language as it's probably supposed to be used, right? Or supposed to, most importantly. So transformational for me, but we need ethical AI. So there's that balance. But
Agreed.
just like anything,
Agreed.
we need ethical use of technology like mobile phones. We needed ethical use of radio, apparently. I heard on somebody talk the other day that there was worry that when radio came out, that all the youth were getting addicted to radio like they were to alcohol, right? And
Wow.
that radio was going to be like the fall down of
Mm.
society because people were listening to rock and roll or whatever. I don't know, right? But and now we have the same fear over TV. We have the same fear over the internet. We have the same fear over
Of
mobile
course.
technology. We have the same fear over AI, right? The reality is we'll
Mm.
look back and probably go, maybe not what we were worried about, but certainly ethical, yes. But we cannot like put our heads under the pillow and not think about it. So just leading me on now to like closing this off, Nathan. It's been brilliant, really great to talk to you. You've shared some incredible insights, loads of lovely stories and connections to the
Thank
way that
you.
your brain thinks and the work that you've been doing and your education, everything else. Being value driven this conversation, so I appreciate it. If people want to get involved in some of the work you do, support this event that's coming up in 2025, I think, because I'm sure there'll be a lot going into it. But also, if they want to find out more about the work that you're doing, where do they need to go? What do they need to do?
Okay, so basically, I have a website called NeuroExpression. So if you type in NeuroExpression on Google, it should be the first thing that comes up. On that website, it will detail things that are going on and it will detail the mission. Also, there's a free PDF called What is Dyspraxia? And that is created in a visual way, and it's the purpose is to empower neurodivergent people. I really want feedback from the neurodivergent community on not only if they like it, but how it can be improved, because this is an ongoing process. The exhibition will be in 2026, but we're also currently looking at hopefully getting funding for a neurodivergent-friendly book, and this will, depending if the funding is successful, this will be a book that will contain stories from neurodivergent people, and it will basically be another piece for the neurodivergent community. And finally, I have a YouTube channel, which is kind of separate to my social enterprise, but it's called Visual Knowledge. And basically, we talk about neurodivergence. We specifically talk about dyspraxia, a bit of psychology, and also a little bit of philosophy. And I detail some of my journey of NeuroExpression on there as well.
Amazing, that's brilliant. I urge people to go and check all of that out. I think I might have got the date wrong around, so you said 2026, that's the year, right? Shows you how much effort is going to go into something of this type.
Yeah, just one final thing. I'm on LinkedIn as well, NeuroExpression on LinkedIn. I forgot to promote my LinkedIn, sorry.
Perfect. No, go to LinkedIn, go connect with Nathan. Listen, real pleasure to have you on. Really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, urge people to go and check out your stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.